I'm delighted to join my colleagues here to talk about this so-called anti-woke capitalism or anti-ESG scheme that has been propagated. I think the important thing to begin with is to understand what is happening out there, why this has happened. The Republicans would like us to believe that some bizarre viral epidemic of wokeism has spread into America's great financial companies, into the investment advisors, into the banks, into all kinds of fiduciaries, and that needs to be somehow excised. That is not what has happened. That is preposterous magical thinking. What has happened is that the long forecast dangers of climate change that scientists have been telling us about for years have now gotten so real and so immediate that they have hit the due diligence horizon for big banks, big investment companies, corporate boards, and other fiduciaries. When you owe somebody else a fiduciary duty, like your shareholders or your investors or your customers at a bank, then you have to tell them the truth. And you have to tell them the truth about risks. And the risks associated with climate change, the risks caused by the fossil fuel industry's relentless emissions, are now so real and so immediate that they can't be denied by big institutions that have no real interest in climate change but are absolutely obliged to tell the truth as fiduciaries. And so that fiduciary threshold, that due diligence horizon has been crossed, and the fossil fuel industry, which is used to bullying to get its way, is now pushing this completely fake anti-ESG effort in order to try to undo what the free market and what real life and facts and fiduciary obligations are causing other industries to deal with. The one telltale clue here is that when they're done talking about woke capitalism and when they're done talking about anti-ESG stuff, when you actually look at what the objection is, what the specific thing is that they're pushing back against, in the ESG, it's always the E. It's never the S, it's never the G. It's not social stuff, it's not governance stuff, it's environmental stuff. And within that E for environmental stuff, it's E for emissions. That is always the gravamen of the complaint. So that tells you a lot about who's behind this. And who is pitching it tells you a lot about who's behind this, because you've got fossil fuel funded organizations like the Republican Attorney General's Association that is cranking up and turning out Republican attorney generals to push this theory. You've got the Republican state treasurers, often funded by the fossil fuel industry, and a group called the State Financial Officers Foundation, which has glommed the state treasurers together to try to push on this. You get state boards like the Texas Railroad Commission, again, heavily involved with the fossil fuel industry, that are pushing all of this. When you look at what it is, you can see that its target is always fossil fuel emissions, and you can see that its proponents are always fossil fuel funded. That tells you why we are where we are. So the rule that the fossil fuel industry pushed through during the Trump administration, an administration which did essentially everything the fossil fuel industry wanted it to do, would have restricted the ability of investment professionals to deliver the products that customers actually want and prevent them from looking at environmental risk, social issues, or governance. Again, this is really about the environmental piece. The Biden rule just undoes that. Nobody has to do ESG stuff. That's dictated by customer demand. But if you want to, and if your customers are demanding that, and if you want to protect them from climate risk, well, there you go. You have to do it. Another clue about the mischief here is who some of the propagators of this theory have been. One is the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is a notorious climate denial group. It has received millions of dollars from the Koch brothers' political enterprise, from Koch foundations, and has plenty of fossil fuel ties. The Texas Public Policy Foundation, another group that is a front group for the oil and gas industry. I've already mentioned RAGA, which is heavily fossil fuel funded. It helped produce Scott Pruitt, who you may remember from EPA disgrace, and they had such control over RAGA that they were able to get him as the Attorney General to write a letter with the identical text from a fossil fuel company and send it into the EPA under his own letterhead, under his own signature as Attorney General, even though the entire text was written by a fossil fuel company. So that's the kind of relationship with RAGA, which, by the way, also helped turn people out for the January 6th insurrection. Really, really high-quality operation there. The last group that I'll mention is the Marble Freedom Trust. The Marble Freedom Trust is the 501c4 pop-up operation that magically appeared in Utah to be the recipient of a $1.6 billion slush fund gifted to it by a far-right billionaire. That put it into the hands of a guy named Leonard Leo, who I've talked about here on the floor before, who's the orchestrator of the scheme to capture the Supreme Court and put it into special interest hands. His reward for his success in that project was this $1.6 billion slush fund that he now controls, and he controls it through that Utah 501c4 pop-up called the Marble Freedom Trust. And the guy who delivered that money into the Marble Freedom Trust was also famous for his support for the Heartland Institute, which is really just an epic climate denial crowd, to the point where one of their more notorious acts was to put up a billboard equating climate scientists to the Unabomber. That is the quality of the debate about climate change that the Heartland Institute brought. And the billionaire who's teed up Marble Freedom Trust was a prime backer of all of that, and indeed had his CFO go on the board of Heartland Institute, try to keep the thing afloat so that it could be moderately well managed and continue to do its great work of billboards that compared the climate scientists to the Unabomber. So that's what we're at. These guys are deep into this anti-ESG push. The dark money operation that I talk about on the floor all the time is behind this ESG thing, just the way it's behind the capture of the court, just the way it's behind the whole climate denial operation that has stymied progress on climate in this building. A few $1 billion here and there in politics turns out to deliver a lot, and the fossil fuel industry desperately wants to stop people who have fiduciary obligations to tell the truth about climate risk to their clients, to the people who they have that fiduciary risk to, and this is the pitch to do that, so that there's a legal hook to stop people from meeting their fiduciary obligations by disclosing real-life actual climate risk, now that it is so clear and so immediate that it is now obliged to be disclosed for due diligence. So let us vote no on HJ Res 30, and let's do more than that. Let's call this out as a phony op. This is a scheme run by the fossil fuel industry to try to solve the problem it has, that its emissions problems are now so real that fiduciaries have to address it. That's the problem. And a fake operation funded by billions of dollars in dark money through all these slimy corporations and entities that don't disclose who their real donors are, and through all these political operatives who get their funding from the fossil fuel industry, that is not something we want to encourage in this country. We have enough of the public not being listened to. In this case, actual customers, actual clients are not being listened to because of this pressure. Let's call it out. Let's put an end to it. This is not healthy. This is something rotten in Denmark. And so with that, I will yield the floor.